Hey, what's up, guys? It's Oakley, and we're going to be covering the vampire counts. Now, we're going to be breaking this up into the first part, which is just going to be general background, getting a feel for the vampire counts, almost an introduction, and then we're going to get into the core units, special units, rare units, heroes, and lords. So I have with me today Gray Hunter, who has his own channel, Gaming Shenanigans. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello, guys. I am, as you can probably tell from the accent, Australian, and I do indeed do Warhammer lore videos on my channel. Uh, they're kind of not as frequent as I would like. Unfortunately, real life gets in the way, but when I get the chance to do collaborations with people like Oakley, it's a lot of fun. So hopefully you enjoy my
Yeah.
company.
And speaking of that, we're missing Arch today. That's Arch
This
Warhammer.
is
He
sad.
usually joins us, but I'll link him below in the comments. Sadly, he couldn't make it for this one. Nonetheless, we're going to dive right into it. So, general overview of the vampire counts. I've pulled up the wiki here. So, just broadly speaking, from what I've been able to discern from this, is the vampire counts are an amalgamation of horror. Basically, you pull vampires, you pull skeletons, you got zombies, you got mutants, you got all kinds of stuff, and you just put it together in an army of horror, and you unleash it upon the enemy. They're all about slow moving ranks of zombies and skeletons, and then these powerful special heroes or units in the background. So very interesting in terms of how they seem to play out. They have special features like having the ability to replenish their ranks. They have a lot of reliance on magic, but on the downside, they don't actually have many units that have range outside of magic. So lots of particular things about them. I'm going to pass it over to Grey Hunter, who's going to be able to flesh out a little bit of the feel for the vampire counts. However.
Oh, I hope so. I do like the vampires. The vampire counts are amazing. So, usually when you think of vampires, you think bats, right? But actually, the vampire counts don't really have all that much to do with bats. They're kind of a thematic thing that got chucked in because people expected. But the vampire counts themselves are actually the result of science gone wrong, pretty much. Back in the ye old days of Warhammer, in the timeline, there was a guy called Nagash, who we've talked about in previous videos, and his deal was he was basically a necromancer, but he created this thing called the Elixir of Life. And vampires actually come from somebody else trying to figure out the secret to that and getting it very, very wrong. And then somebody else trying to kill them, and the magic and science kind of combined and made this new form of life, which was the first vampires. They're kind of different to pretty much every other kind of vampire that you've seen in fiction. They have a little bit of everything. They've got a little bit of the Bram Stoker Dracula kind of thing. They've got a little bit of it's not so much Twilight, but they've got the younger sort of postmodern vampire feel to them as well. But they're very unique in terms of fantasy, so they're a lot of fun. Should we go over the bloodlines that they possibly have, Oakley?
Yeah, and I did actually have a couple questions here. So you talk about this elixir of life gone wrong, a new form of life. So the vampires kind of have the ability to resurrect the dead. Is that
They do, yes. They are necromancers as well as, well, vampires.
so? Basically, the core of this force is going to be the vampires themselves, and we'll talk about the bloodlines inherent in those vampires themselves. But they're kind of the backbone of this structure, and they use their necromancy to form an army around them. Is that the general idea?
Very much so, yes. Yeah, very much so. The vampires themselves are not particularly numerous. There's not a huge amount of them because, well, they're vampires, and like pretty much all vampires in fiction, they don't play well with each other. So you'll very rarely get more than a handful cooperating together to actually achieve a goal. So the majority of their armies are what they can raise using their necromantic powers. But the core is always going to be the vampires because obviously, if you kill the thing that's creating these undead constructs, the undead constructs start to die.
Hmm. So if you were to snipe the main leadership of an army, the rest of the force would kind of not flee, but almost disintegrate back into the ground or collapse.
Exactly so. Exactly so. There's on the tabletop, there is a rule for when the general dies, every unit starts slowly crumbling unless they're within range of another vampire. So it's very much it's very character driven, this army, because if you lose the leadership, you lose the whole thing. So I'm hoping that that will translate over to the actual Total War game. That should be a lot of fun. If you have to protect your general, because in previous Total Wars, losing a general wasn't the end of the world. You could usually recover from it, and you could generally use in the earlier ones your general as a kind of heavy cavalry to just kind of hammer and anvil things. But you can't do that with a vampiric general, at least not without risk, if you
Exactly.
get me.
So there's a certain risk, but nonetheless, these guys are super badasses.
Oh
so
yeah,
so
yes,
we'll quantify that, I guess. And as you alluded to, there are these main bloodlines that make up these old vampiric families. And actually, I'm not sure if all of them are vampires per se, but we'll get into this. So you got the Lamians, the Blood Dragons, the Neckarchs, the Strigoi, and the Van Karsteins.
yes you do. So we'll start with the von Carsteins first, I guess, because the von Carsteins are probably going to be the bloodline that gets the most time dedicated to it in the Total War games. So the von Carsteins are basically your vanilla vampires, if you like. They're the actual counts that the vampire counts draw their name from, because they're lords of a province in the Empire called Sylvania, because of course it is. Of course it is. And they're generally the leaders of vampire kind, as much as vampires have leaders. The legendary lord that we know they're getting, Manfred von Carstein, is obviously a von Carstein. And they're basically your generic vampire in essence. So you can do pretty much anything you want with them and theme them how you like.
I see. And these guys are, um, in what sense are they generic vampires? Because you said before these vampires are kind of a mix of all other vampires. Um, so if we're going to talk about the generic vampire, what is it? Like a super
They
strong guy
they
on
channel
foot?
very much the Dracula that you would come to expect, the haughty lord of the night. So think Bram Stoker, except Bram Stoker's coming to kill you with a massive sword because he can, and there you go. That's von Carstein in a nutshell.
I see. Okay, and these guys are going to be kind of either on foot with massive weapons, brandishing magic abilities, kind of running around as necromancers, or they could be on mounts, kind of like we saw in the trailer on these giant zombie dragons and things like that. Is that unique to the von Karsteins, or is that something we can expect for all heroes and lords?
You can see it generally with all of the bloodlines. Some of them will favor certain things over others if the theme is kept in the Total War games, such as the blood dragons will be more naturally predisposed to getting in the thick of things and fighting. The von Carsteins kind of do everything. The Larmians, not so much. But perhaps we should talk about each bloodline and then
Yeah,
expand on.
let's flesh them out. So the
Yeah,
von Karsteins are the run of the mill kind of generic overlords, who were part of the Empire once and split off, and they kind of run the keeps and the castles. But you got a bunch of other guys, so I'll let you dive into these at your discretion then.
you do. All right, let's start with the Larmians then, with the other ones because they're kind of the progenitors of vampire kind. So the original vampire city was Lamia back in ye olde times in Warhammer Fantasy. And the first vampire was called Neferata. She's the one who had the whole science experiment gone wrong thing happen. Her bloodline is mainly female because she doesn't trust men to get things right. You know, it's kind of a bit of an olive branch to feminism, I guess, if you like, and in the same essence, kind of a backhand to it as well, because their whole shtick is that they're spies and seductresses. So they specialize in covert kind of stuff. They do currently have a presence in the game. They currently have taken over a dwarven hold called Silver Pinnacle, and the dwarves are kind of ticked about that. So I'm hoping that if bloodlines are included, they will exist. So you'll have the dwarves and vampires coming into conflict very early in the game. The blood dragons, they're, as I said earlier, very, very dedicated to combat. Their whole thing is dedicating themselves entirely to figuring out war and how to fight more effectively, and also hunting dragons, as the name kind of alludes to. Their progenitor managed to fight a dragon, kill it, and then drink its blood, and it cured his need to feed. So the blood dragons are kind of Zen warriors, if you like, the samurai of the vampire counts, and their end goal is to essentially achieve a balance with life, which seems kind of strange for vampires. But as we discussed a little bit earlier, the Warhammer vampires are kind of different to most fantasy vampires, which is one of the nice things about them. The Necrarchs is the third bloodline, and these guys are kind of like the mad scientists for vampire counts. They specialize more in necromancy and magical arts and experimentation than most of the other vampires do. They're kind of like scholars. If you imagine them as, this might be a little left of field for a reference, but in the Underworld series, the Tannis is the scholar for the vampire coven that Victor and Celine belong to. These guys are basically him, except on steroids. And finally, the Strigoi, who are cannibal vampires. They aren't strictly cannibals. They will eat pretty much anything, but they're basically monsters. They don't really have any shred of humanity left. And that's, again, seems a little strange to say vampires with humanity, but the Strigoi are kind of the lost causes of vampire kind, and they're shunned by their fellow vampires. So the five bloodlines there, I'm hoping that they'll appear because the blood dragons, obviously, thematically, could be like the champion agents. The Lamians could be your spies, and the Necrarchs could be something that helped with administration. But you never know. I guess we'll just have to see what CA says about it because they haven't really mentioned anything about the vampire counts so far.
Yeah.
Do you have any questions on that, Oakley? Now that I've bombarded you with so much information.
No, so I think we've outlined the mid bloodlines there, and you said that previously the bloodlines and vampires do tend to feud. So okay, I understand these guys will probably feud with one another. Are they all in different parts of the world, or do they live in some sort of hierarchy in the same place?
The Von Carsteins obviously live in the province of Sylvania. The Lamians kind of keep to themselves because they don't really trust anybody else. But the Blood Dragons, Necrarchs, and Strigoi can kind of be found wherever there are vampires, but there won't be very many of them.
Okay.
The Blood Dragons are the most likely to actually get on with their kindred because they don't really care about feuds. They just like to fight.
Cool. So we'll see some mixing, and each army is not going to be just one bloodline, right? You'll have multiple bloodlines coming together to field a force.
Ideally, you would want that, assuming that they bother to include bloodlines. Ideally, you would want to combine all of them together.
Right. Okay.
So, blood dragons would be your generals and elite soldiers, perhaps, and Strigoi would be the guys that you throw in when you need to break a line.
Yeah. So as
But it's all of this right now is on speculation because
exactly.
obviously CA hasn't said anything.
Now I do wonder, so what is the overarching goal of the vampires? Like what is their ultimate goal in the Warhammer universe? Do they just want to I think I remember it being they want to have all humans be essentially cattle and just farm the humans for their blood?
Essentially, yeah. It depends on who you ask, because again, blood dragons kind of less about the whole overlording of humans. They're kind of more about the figuring out how to kill things more effectively. And the Necrocs, they just want to be left alone in their libraries. They just want to study. But everybody else, kind of, their big deal is they want to be rulers of the world.
I see. So every faction has its own will to dominate. Well, that'll be cool.
Basically,
All right.
yeah. It just changes focus a little bit. Like they have their underlying goals to go with the general conquer the world.
Yeah. Well, cool. So I think we did a good introduction to the main structure of the vampires, how they play out, and stuff like that. Um, we're now going to kind of have a break here where we're going to move into the main army units, the core of your force. So let's go ahead and pivot onto that.